Welcome to Life Stories. What happens when love and betrayal collide? When a man chooses power over his heart, only to realize too late what he has lost. Ethan Caldwell abandoned his wife, Rachel, under family pressure, unaware that she was carrying his children. 7 years later, fate brings them together again, but this time, Rachel has built a new life. One that may no longer have room for him. Will she open the door to the past? Or is it too late for redemption? Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's journey of love, regret, and second chances. The Caldwell estate was grand. The kind of place built not just with wealth but with a history of power, expectation, and unrelenting ambition. Its halls were lined with portraits of men who had built their fortunes from steel, finance, and politics, men who had passed down not just money, but a sense of duty, of obligation, of what it meant to carry the Caldwell name. Ethan Caldwell sat alone in his study, the heavy scent of bourbon lingering in the air. The fireplace crackled softly, casting flickering shadows against the dark wooden walls. He hadn't touched his drink. His mind was too consumed by the weight of what he had been told that morning. "She's barren, Ethan. Do you understand what that means for this family?" His mother's voice still echoed in his mind, sharp and unyielding. Margaret Caldwell was a woman who had mastered the art of control. Her words were not spoken in anger but with the precision of someone cutting away the unnecessary parts of a picture, removing anything that did not serve the greater purpose of the Caldwell legacy. She had stood before him that morning, regal and composed, delivering her verdict with the cold efficiency of a judge. "It's time to end this, before it costs you everything." Ethan had clenched his fists at the time, trying to resist the pressure. But the weight of his mother's expectations was suffocating. He was the Caldwell heir. And heirs did not marry for love, they married for power. For legacy. Rachel, with her warm laughter and soft kindness, had never belonged in this world. He had brought her in on a promise of love, of standing together against anything. But now, he wasn't sure if love was enough. That evening, as he walked down the hallway toward Rachel, the sound of her humming reached his ears. It was a simple tune, a song she often sang when she was lost in thought. The warmth of it made something tighten in his chest. For a brief moment, he considered turning around, pretending this night wasn't about to unravel everything they had built together. Rachel looked up when he entered the room, a smile forming on her lips. "You're home early," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. She had been folding laundry. A small, ordinary moment that somehow felt more intimate than anything else in the world. "I was thinking we could," she started. But he cut her off. "Rachel." There was something in his voice that made her stop mid-sentence. The smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. "Ethan, what's wrong?" He looked at her then. Really looked at her. The woman who had loved him without conditions. Who had stood by him through everything. He had once promised to cherish her, to fight for her, to build a future together. But now, with his mother's voice whispering in his mind, he knew what he had to do. "We need to separate." The words felt like stones dropping into an abyss. Heavy and irreversible. Rachel blinked. "What?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. As if she hadn't truly heard him. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet her gaze. This isn't working." She took a step closer, searching his face for some sign that this was a mistake. "Ethan, if this is about the children, we can find another way. We can adopt. We can." He shook his head. "It's not something we can fix." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Rachel's hands trembled as she reached for the back of a chair. Steadying herself. "So that's it? You made a vow to me, Ethan." "We stood right there, in front of everyone, and you told me we would face everything together." Her voice broke. "But now, because of them, because of your mother, you're throwing me away?" The pain in her eyes was unbearable. But he didn't move. He couldn't. "If you walk away from me now," she whispered, her voice shaking, "I don't think I'll ever forgive you." His chest tightened. He wanted to say something. To tell her that he didn't want this. That he loved her. That this wasn't about her but about something bigger than them both. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he turned and walked out, leaving behind the only woman he had ever truly loved. The night was cruel as Rachel stood in the grand foyer, a small suitcase by her feet. Rain pounded against the tall windows, streaking the glass like tears. Ethan stood at the base of the staircase, his hands clenched at his sides. He had thought this would be easier, that he could convince himself this was the right thing to do. But now, as he looked at her, he realized how wrong he had been. "Please," she whispered, "just tell me why." He didn't answer. He couldn't. Rachel let out a shaky breath, her fingers tightening around the handle of her suitcase. "If this is what you call right, Ethan, then you've lost far more than just me." With that, she turned and walked out into the storm, the door closing behind her with a final, resounding thud. Ethan didn't move. He didn't go after her. He simply stood there, letting the sound of the rain and the emptiness of the house settle into his bones. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Caldwell felt truly alone. Rachel had always imagined that starting over would feel like freedom. Instead, it felt like she was drowning. Chicago was nothing like New York. It lacked the polished perfection of the Caldwell estate, the quiet corridors, the controlled elegance. Here, the city was loud, alive, unpredictable. The streets were filled with hurried strangers. And the skyline, though grand, felt indifferent. She rented a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, just enough space for a bed, a chair, and later, a crib. The walls were thin, the plumbing unreliable, but it was hers. It was survival. The loneliness was the hardest part. There were nights when she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of distant traffic, wondering if Ethan ever thought of her, if he regretted what he had done. But those nights grew fewer as her body changed, as the life inside her grew stronger. And then, one cold April morning, they arrived. Two perfect little boys, their tiny hands grasping at the world with the quiet determination of survivors. Caleb and Noah. The names had come to her in the quiet moments of the night. Whispered promises to the children she hadn't known she would have to raise alone. She had never imagined being a mother this way, without a partner, without support, but the moment she held them, she knew she would do whatever it took to protect them. The next few years were a blur of exhaustion and love. Mornings spent rushing between jobs. Evenings filled with laughter and lullabies. She worked at a cafe, brewing coffee for businessmen who reminded her too much of Ethan. Cleaning tables, counting tips, stretching every dollar. It was there, in the midst of the ordinary, that she met Adam. He was a regular, always ordering black coffee, always carrying a book. The first time he smiled at her, it was nothing more than politeness. But over time, it became something else. A familiarity, a presence, a quiet, steady force in a life that had been nothing but chaos. She didn't let herself think about love. Love had failed her before. But Adam never pushed. He never pried. He simply showed up, with an extra cup of tea when she looked tired, with a small toy for the boys when they started toddling into the cafe, with a steady, unwavering kindness that made her chest ache. It wasn't until Caleb fell at the playground, his tiny knee scraped, his cries filling the air, that Rachel realized just how much Adam had become a part of their lives. He had rushed over without hesitation, pulling a small first aid kit from his coat. "I'm a doctor," he had explained, his voice calm, his hands gentle as he cleaned the wound. And in that moment, something shifted. Rachel wasn't sure if it was trust. But for the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't alone. Then, one afternoon, everything changed. The cafe was busy, the lunch rush in full swing. When she saw him, Ethan, he was standing outside, his hands stuffed into his coat pockets, his gaze fixed on her through the window. For a moment, Rachel thought she was imagining it. That time had played a cruel trick on her. But then his eyes moved, past her, to the small table where Caleb and Noah sat, their identical faces glowing with laughter as they shared a cookie. Rachel felt the world tilt beneath her feet. He knew. Rachel's heart pounded as she stood frozen behind the cafe counter, her hands gripping the edge as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Ethan was still outside, unmoving, his gaze locked on the boys. She willed herself to breathe, to think, but her mind was racing. After all these years, after all the pain, why was he here? Then, as if feeling her stare, Ethan's eyes lifted to hers. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. The cafe bustled around her, customers chatting, the coffee machine hissing, but everything else faded. All she could see was the man she had once loved, the man who had abandoned her. And then he stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed softly. Ethan walked toward the counter with careful, deliberate steps, his face unreadable. Rachel's fingers dug into the wood. Rachel. His voice was softer than she expected. Hesitant. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to remain composed. What are you doing here? His eyes flickered toward the boys again before returning to her. I didn't know, he said, his voice thick with something she couldn't quite place. Regret? Guilt? Rachel's chest tightened. You didn't know because you didn't care to ask. The words landed hard, and for the first time, she saw him flinch. Good. Let him feel even a fraction of what she had felt. Rachel, please, he murmured. Can we talk? She shook her head. No, Ethan, you don't get to just show up after 7 years and act like you have a right to anything. Ethan exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. I want to know them. I don't want to take them from you. I swear, I need to be in their lives. Rachel let out a short, bitter laugh. Now you want to be a father? Where was that when I was terrified? Alone, with no idea how I was going to raise them? Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but a small voice interrupted them. Mom? Rachel turned, her heart lodging in her throat. Caleb and Noah were standing by their table, their bright eyes flickering between her and Ethan. She saw it then, the realization dawning in Ethan's face. The way his jaw tightened, the way his breathing hitched. He saw himself in them. The resemblance was undeniable. Noah, the more observant of the two, studied Ethan carefully. Who's that? Rachel's pulse roared in her ears. She had never planned for this moment. Never imagined having to explain. Before she could speak, Ethan took a cautious step forward. Hi, boys. His voice was gentle, but there was something raw in it. I'm Ethan. Caleb tilted his head. Do we know you? Rachel's hands clenched at her sides. She should stop this. She should tell Ethan to leave. But something in the way he looked at them, so lost, so broken, made her pause. No, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't. Ethan swallowed hard, his eyes pleading with her. But maybe we could change that? Rachel's breath caught. She had spent years protecting her boys from this moment. She wasn't sure if she was ready. But for their sake, she needed to decide. Rachel stood there, feeling the weight of a decision she never thought she'd have to make. The past 7 years had been built on a foundation of resilience, on learning to live without Ethan, on creating a world where she and the boys were enough. And yet, here he was, standing before her, asking for a chance to rewrite the story. She wanted to say no, to turn her back on him the way he had turned his back on her. But then she looked at Caleb and Noah. Their innocent eyes, full of curiosity, searched her face for answers. They didn't know the pain, the betrayal, the nights she had spent alone, whispering promises to them that she would always be enough. They only saw a stranger who looked strangely familiar, who stood before them with something raw and fragile in his expression. Rachel swallowed hard and exhaled. I don't know, she admitted finally. I don't know if I can trust you. And I don't know if they need you. Ethan's face tightened, but he nodded. I understand, but I just want a chance to know them. Even if it's just a little. Her heart clenched. He wasn't demanding. He wasn't the man she had once known, full of certainty and arrogance. He was different now, more hesitant, more human. Rachel turned to the boys. Why don't you go sit back down? Okay? They hesitated, but Noah nodded and pulled Caleb with him. When they were out of earshot, Rachel faced Ethan again, her voice low and firm. If you're serious about this, Ethan, you have to understand something. I will not let you walk in and out of their lives. They don't deserve that. If you're here for good. Ethan exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. I am. Rachel studied him for a long moment, her heart warring with itself. Could she trust him? Would this undo everything she had worked for? And then, a voice broke through the tension. You don't have to do this alone. Rachel turned to see Adam standing a few feet away, his face calm but serious. He had been watching, waiting, letting her handle this on her own, but now, he was here, steady and unwavering. Ethan's eyes flicked toward him, a silent understanding passing between them. He could see it, the way Adam stood close but not possessive, protective but not controlling, the way Rachel seemed to lean into his presence. Even without realizing it, something inside Ethan twisted. He had lost her, not just to time, but to someone who had been there when he wasn't. Rachel took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. We'll take this slow. I won't promise anything, but I'll let you meet them. Ethan's eyes softened with relief. Thank you. Rachel wasn't sure if she was doing the right thing. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to let the past breathe. The weeks that followed were cautious and uncertain. Ethan met Caleb and Noah in small moments, at the park, at the cafe, in quiet conversations where he learned who they were. Not just as children, but as individuals. Caleb, the more adventurous of the two, always eager to climb higher and run faster. Noah, thoughtful and observant, always asking questions. Rachel watched carefully, her heart balancing between fear and hope. She wasn't ready to trust Ethan fully, but she couldn't ignore the way the boys seemed drawn to him. The way they unconsciously mirrored his expressions, his mannerisms. They didn't know the pain he had caused her. They only knew that he was someone who wanted to be there. But Rachel wasn't the same woman she had been years ago. She had built a life, a future, one that no longer revolved around Ethan Caldwell. She had Adam, who had been there through every scraped knee, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt. And she had herself. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Rachel sat on a park bench, watching her boys chase after fireflies. Ethan sat beside her, his hands clasped together. They're incredible, he said softly. She nodded. I know. A long silence stretched between them before Ethan finally spoke again. I know I can never make up for what I did, Rachel, but thank you for letting me be here. Even a little. She exhaled, glancing at him. I'm not doing this for you, Ethan. I'm doing this for them. And with that, she stood, calling her boys over. Adam waited near the car, smiling as they ran toward him. Rachel looked back one last time at Ethan, then turned away. Her future was no longer defined by her past. It was hers, and hers alone. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more heartfelt and meaningful videos.